Here's Greg Kugel to explain what he thinks is the best argument against theism.
So what's the best argument that I've heard against theism? Well, this is a little bit difficult to answer in one sense. It's easy in another sense because there's so little to choose among. It's difficult because characteristically, people do not offer arguments against theism. They offer complaints against God and against the Bible and against religion, but they don't offer straightforward kind of arguments against theism. And one of the reasons is a lot of atheists don't think they need to.
Citation needed. What are these complaints exactly? I've heard some atheists say that they don't need to make arguments against the existence of God, but that's not the same as saying they don't need to make arguments against theism if they're trying to convince people that theism is unjustified. I have several arguments against the existence of God, but even if there is a God, the main argument against theism is that even if there is a God, there isn't sufficient reason to believe in one.
They think that atheism is the default position, that their view kind of is the standard view, even though less than, I think, 2% of the people in the whole entire world, the population of the globe, hold to that view. They still think it's the standard view, and so they bear no burden of proof.
What does the number of people who hold a belief have to do with whether that belief carries a burden of proof or not? The fact that lots of people believe in something does not obligate anyone to provide an excuse for their non-belief. I think a necessary condition for having a burden of proof is having the goal of convincing someone of something. I'm not trying to convince anyone that there is no God, therefore I have no burden of proof. You can't have a burden of proof if you're not trying to prove anything. I don't even think theists have a burden of proof if they're not trying to convince anyone that their religion is true. Also, where do you get the figure that only 2% of people in the world are atheist? In order for that to be true, the majority of the population of China would have to be theist or agnostic.
So generally, they do not try to argue in favor of atheism and therefore directly against theism. They just raise complaints.
Like what? Do you think that pointing out that there's not enough evidence to justify theism is a complaint?
I just want to make an observation that a complaint against the Bible, or a complaint against religion, or a complaint against Christians is not an argument against God.
I really don't know anyone who is saying that complaints against religion or religious people are arguments against God. Also, Greg keeps conflating arguments against God with arguments against theism. There's a lot of overlap between the two, but they're not the same thing.
Just so you don't get those confused. Those are different things. They may be legitimate challenges or points in their own arena, but they're not arguments against God. If you want to disprove God, you have to deal with the assertion or the proposition that God exists, and then give reasons why you think that the proposition God exists is a false one.
But you said you're trying to specify the best argument against theism, not the best argument against God.
In dealing with that issue, I've heard very few arguments. In fact, most of the arguments amount to arguments that those are the foundational challenges to that notion are attempts to show that something about the belief in God is incoherent, that is contradictory. Maybe the term God is incoherent. Nobody knows what we're talking about, but it's curious that people have written books against this thing that nobody knows what we're talking about, and I don't know how you could write a book about it if we don't know what we're talking about here. So I don't think that's going to work.
You don't have to understand a contradictory notion in order to explain why it's contradictory. The idea of God, at least as contemporary apologists and theologians define God, is contradictory in multiple ways, so I can go on for a while about all the different ways in which it makes no sense. The fact that I can do so at length in no way constitutes evidence that I actually find the notion coherent.
The best argument, I think, and I actually think this is the best attempt that I've heard. I don't think it goes through, but it's different forms of the argument from evil.
I don't consider that to be the best argument against God because it relies on a very specific definition of God. It only works if you define God as all-powerful and perfectly loving. There are many entities which people have believed to exist throughout human history that have been called gods that don't fit that definition. I find the arguments that point to the incoherence of the supernatural to be more thorough, because most, if not all, concepts of gods have defined them as not being products of nature.
It is the best in terms of being an aggressive challenge. That is, it's an attempt to show that there's an incoherence or a contradiction in the Christian worldview.
Yeah, but not in the worldview of Greek or Roman paganism. That's the problem.
And that is an aggressive type of defeater. If it goes through, then Christianity is falsified. It also has tremendous rhetorical force and great emotional appeal.
I don't consider those to be virtues of an argument. Sure, they can make an argument more convincing, but only for reasons that exploit irrationality.
That is, it's easy to characterize evil in the world in graphic ways that make people react to it. And it is also something that people feel deeply in their hearts because they have to engage the problem of evil themselves. They have to deal with evil in their lives. And so consequently, this is a very, very powerful challenge to Christianity. Now, I think it can be met, and there are lots of ways to answer it. There's the deductive problem and the inductive problem. The one that most people are familiar with, the deductive problem, has been largely abandoned by philosophers because they know it's been answered. That is, that there's a contradiction between the idea of there being a good God and a powerful God and evil existing in the world, because it does seem that it's possible that there can be a morally sufficient reason for God to allow evil for a season.
No, there really isn't. In order for there to be a morally sufficient reason for God to allow evil, two criteria would need to be met. The first is that the end God intends to achieve by allowing evil would have to be good enough to make up for that evil. The second criterion would be that the supposedly all-powerful God would have to lack the power to achieve that end without allowing evil. Even if the end is so good that it makes up for the evil that was used to achieve it, that end would not be sufficient reason to allow evil if it could be achieved without allowing evil. Since God is all-powerful, he would have the power to achieve any end without allowing evil. Therefore, it would be a contradiction to say that he had a morally sufficient reason for allowing it.
And that is, of course, the biblical worldview. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's part of the story, but there's a resolution to it in the end, and God uses evil for good, ultimately.
But if God needs to use evil for good, then he lacks the power to achieve that good without using it. If he has the power to achieve good without allowing evil, then he lacks sufficient reason to allow that evil.
So that's been set aside, or largely by people in the know on this issue. It still persists, though, in the popular realm, and the inductive problem, which is that it's unlikely there's a God because there's so much evil, is getting a little bit more traction, but there are answers and responses to that as well. Like I said, I don't think the argument ultimately goes through, principally because the right way to address the problem of evil is not as a philosopher, as a theologian, but as a human being. Meaning that any human being has to ask the question, what worldview gives the best explanation to the problem of evil?
That depends on what you mean by evil. I don't believe that objective evil exists. It doesn't have to be accounted for if it doesn't exist. If you want to be more specific, you could ask what worldview best accounts for the existence of suffering. I think that worldview is clearly atheism and naturalism. Suffering exists because it disincentivizes us from doing things that undermine our ability to survive and reproduce. Conscious organisms that don't suffer don't survive for very long. Evolution causes us to suffer because it is neither all-powerful nor is it loving. Suffering is the best motivation to survive that evolution was able to come up with.
Let's look at just going to atheism because of evil. You're not going to believe in God, doesn't solve the problem of evil.
I think Greg is equivocating what the problem of evil is. Atheism does, in fact, solve the problem of evil, because the problem of evil is a contradiction between the Abrahamic concept of God and the existence of events that said God allegedly views as evil. The existence of these two things can't contradict one another unless both of them exist. But Greg has shifted the goalpost by talking about the problem of evil as being the problem that you have to deal with evil things in life. That's not what the problem of evil is.
Now you're still stuck with the problem as an atheist. The atheists raised the problem. There is real evil in the world.
No, the problem I raise is that there are things that a supposedly all-powerful and all-loving God allegedly labels as evil in the world. I don't actually believe that there is real evil. There are things that are intolerable to my conscience, but I don't see how those things have any cosmic objective status as being evil.
How do you account for that?
I don't believe in it, so I don't have to account for it.
When you leave theism, you don't leave the problem behind. You don't escape the problem.
Yes, I do, because I no longer have to explain how these two contradictory things both exist. A lot of apologists seem to think that bringing up the problem of evil constitutes an acknowledgement that objective evil exists. That just doesn't follow. That's a total non sequitur. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.